This is Candle and Coffin. Let's uncover the forgotten truth beneath the ashes of history. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this story travels in the twilight of a kingdom bloated with gold and trembling with guilt. A man stood still as the fire ate through his flesh, his eyes unblinking against the flame, his lips unmoved by the agony that tore through his body like a storm across a crumbling fortress. He was Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, a relic of an age that had raised warriors in prayer and buried them in silence. And as the crowd watched the pyre consume him on the cold March day in 1314, few understood that they were witnessing not just a man's death, but the ritual murder of an idea, a symbol, a shadow to long feared by thrones and popes alike. For the Templars had been forged in blood under the holy banner of the cross, tempered in the fires of the Crusades, and crowned not just with the favor of God but with the envy of kings. Their brotherhood spreading across the known world like a tide of stone-willed silence, and sword-sharp devotion, owning castles, commanding fleets, lending gold to emperors and collecting secrets like relics, but power, like a blade, cuts both ways. And in time, the knights who had once stood as the sword of Christendom became its most dangerous memory, a legacy to independent to be ruled, to rich to be ignored, to loyal to a god that no longer served the earthly ambitions of a broken, bitter king named Philip IV of France. It would begin, as these stories always do, not with justice, but with fear whispers in corridors, letters sealed in wax, debts unpaid, and alliances quietly snapped like dry twigs beneath royal boots, until dawn broke on Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, and across the realm, the hounds of power were loosed upon the Templars like wolves upon sheep, dragging these warrior monks from their beds, shackling them with chains rusted by politics, not guilt, and branding them heretics, in the name of a crown that could no longer afford their dignity. And as the torturers went to work in the catacombs of power, and the parchment of law was stained with royal deceit, Jacques de Molay remained silent, then defiant, then broken, then resurrected in flame, for his death would not silence the truth, nor cleanse the sin, but only mark the beginning of a deeper question. When does faith become treason? And when do kings burn their own souls just to keep the throne from trembling? They came not with crowns or titles, but with dust on their boots and guilt in their bones. Men who had slaughtered in the name of God and found no peace in the silence that followed. It was the year 1119, the decades after the First Crusade, had carved a jagged, bloody path into the Holy Land, and Jerusalem, sacred, smoldering, and fragile, sat like a bleeding relic in the hands of Europe's war-hardened faithful. A city defended by too few, coveted by too many, and surrounded by the vengeance of every disinherited soul east of the Mediterranean. Out of this chaos rose 9 knights, nameless in the beginning, anonymous in their ascetic defiance of wealth and glory, who bound themselves by oath to guard the roads of pilgrimage, to be both monks and warriors, blood-stained shepherds, with swords drawn, protecting Christians on their long, perilous walk to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, led by Hugh's deep hands, a man of cold resolve and unwavering conviction. These knights took no wives, no gold, no comforts, only discipline, obedience, and a code that demanded both spiritual purity and martial excellence. They were given quarters in the former Al-Aqsa Mosque, perched atop the Temple Mount, once the site of Solomon's Temple, and it was from the sacred and contested ground that their legend drew its name. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar, their seal which showed to men riding a single horse, a symbol of their humility and unity. But in truth, they were anything but poor, for as their reputation for purity and courage spread across Christendom, so did the donations, the lands, the political favor, until this ragged band of fanatics grew into the most powerful and mysterious military order the world had ever seen. They fought not for plunder, but for God, not for kings, but for the cross. And this made them dangerous, because while other armies fought for dynasties or borders, the Templars fought for eternity itself, and men who do not fear death are difficult to control, and yet, in those first years, they were beloved, praised by popes, protected by royal charters, envied by lords who watched their influence spread like wildfire from the battlefields of Outremer to the banks of Europe. They became the mailed fist of the church, the holy steel behind the crusades. And while their cause was wrapped in scripture and sanctity, their methods were brutal, efficient, and absolute. They took vows, yes, but they also took cities, spilled blood, and built a machine of warfare and finance so advanced it would one day outgrow the very kingdoms it was sworn to serve. And so, the foundation was laid, not of a simple order of knights, but of a coming paradox, a monastic brotherhood that would rise not just through faith, but through the unholy mechanics of politics, power, and money. And in that contradiction, hidden like a knife beneath a cloak, was the seed of their fall. They had begun as barefoot guardians of pilgrims, but within a generation, the Knights Templar no longer walked the roads they owned them. Across Europe, from the mist-choked coast of England to the vineyards of Provence, from the icy stone castles of the Rhineland to the sun-scorched fortresses of Aragon, the red cross of the Templars marked not just piety and protection, but authority, legal, military, and financial, a trinity of dominion no kingdom could match. Their wealth poured in from nobles desperate for salvation, from monarchs who pay for absolution in coin rather than confession, and from pilgrims who gave what little they had for safe passage and safe souls. And yet this wealth was never flaunted. Templar knights still wore simple robes, slept on hard beds, and shared their meals in silence, but behind this veneer of humility, their infrastructure became as vast as any empire, with networks of preceptories and commanderies linking east and west. Like veins pulsing with gold, they created the first system of international banking, a ledger-based economy centuries ahead of its time, where a merchant in Paris could deposit gold in a Templar house and withdraw it in Jerusalem, protected by codes and seals only the order understood. Invisible power, cloaked in holy purpose, they were exempt from taxes, answerable only to the Pope himself, immune to local laws, untouchable by secular courts. And this made them not just useful but dangerous for kings who once viewed them as holy swords, now saw them as arrogant gatekeepers, a separate state within Christendom, answerable to no crown. And yet, their military power only deepened on the front lines of the Crusades. They led charges, held fortresses, and spilled their blood in such quantity that even Muslim chroniclers, their enemies, wrote of their courage with awe and battle. They rode in silence until the moment of contact, their white mantle stained red, their discipline unmatched, their willingness to die absolute. For to fall in combat was not defeat, but a path to eternal glory. And their martyrs were buried, not with mourning, but with pride. They became legends, feared and admired, but also envied. And in the courts of Europe, where loyalty shifted like sand, their isolation began to look less like sanctity and more like insubordination. They took no wives, forged no dynasties, and had no heirs to bribe or threaten a closed circuit of belief and power that could not be manipulated, only destroyed. And so, even as their influence reached heights and dreamt of by the founders, the storm clouds were gathering, whispers in royal halls, rumors of heresy, pagan rites, secret oaths, gold hoarded beneath temples, and gods worshipped in darkness. Accusations, still faint, still dismissed, but seated like rot in the floorboards of an empire that had grown too tall to notice the cracks forming beneath its feet. The fall of an empire never arrives all at once. It comes like dusk, slow and quiet, a dimming of light that is first unnoticed, then undeniable, until darkness swallows everything that once seemed eternal. For the Knights Templar, the twilight began not with a battle lost, but with an age slipping from their grip, a world reshaping itself beneath their feet as the soil of the Holy Land turned to ash, and the fire of their purpose flickered in winds. They could no longer command in the East. The Crusader kingdoms, those fragile bastions carved by Christian steel and sustained by blood, were rotting at the roots, choked by corruption, weakened by pride, and encircled by rising Muslim powers that had learned from every defeat and returned with fire sharpened into strategy. Leaders like Saladin brought not just armies, but vision, and in 1187, the hammer fell, the Battle of Hattin, a crucible of sun and salt and slaughter, where the Templar ranks, armored in faith but outnumbered and outflanked, broke upon the desert like waves against stone. They were cut down, captured, and most chilling of all, executed not in rage but in ritual, with Saladin personally ordering the mass beheading of Templar prisoners, not for vengeance, but to remove their shadow from the battlefield once and for all. Jerusalem fell soon after, and with it, the illusion that Christendom's hold on the East was ordained. The Templars, though bloodied, survived, retreating to their fortresses, rearming, rebuilding. But the truth was already etched into the stone of every broken wall. This was no longer a holy crusade. It was a war of attrition, and the gods were not choosing sides. Successive crusades were launched costly, disorganized, politically poison-led, by kings more interested in titles than tactics, while the Templars found themselves defending shrinking perimeters, losing city after city, finally retreating to the fortress island of Acre, their last stronghold, their final redoubt on the edge of a continent that no longer welcomed them. In 1291, Acre fell in fire and ruin, the Templar banners torn down, the blood of knights soaking the sand, and the survivors fleeing to Cypress Hollow, hardened and haunted by the screams of a dream that had finally died. And so they returned to Europe, not as victors, but as relics battle-scarred, restless, and no longer necessary to a church that now sought politics over war, nor to kings who now saw in the Templars not saviors, but liabilities wrapped in steel and arrogance. Yet still, they did not bend, they rebuilt, quietly, efficiently, their order intact, their wealth untouched, their loyalty to God unshaken, and in that resilience, in that refusal to disband or diminish, the seeds of fear were sown in the hearts of rulers who did not yet understand that the most dangerous enemy is the one who has nothing left to lose. He was called Philip the Fair, but there was nothing fair about him. Beneath the marble mask of regal beauty lay the gaunt mind of a man who saw thrones not as sacred trusts, but as chessboards where loyalty was expendable, truth negotiable, and faith a weapon to be wielded, bent, or broken as needed. By the dawn of the 14th century, Philip IV of France stood atop a realm crumbling beneath its own weight. His treasury was drained by wars, his nobles were restless, and the papacy had become his personal battleground. He had taxed the clergy, expelled the Jews, devalued currency, and still the crown's coffers gaped open like a beggar's mouth, and there, in his line of sight, stood the Templars, serene and unbothered, sitting on fortunes beyond royal imagination, exempt from taxation, untouched by secular law, bound not to any king, but to a pope in Rome. He owed them money, vast sums borrowed during his conflicts with England and Flanders, and the thought of being indebted to monk warriors who knelt to no earthly throne gnawed at him. Like a worm in the marrow, they were a state within his state, a loyal army beholden to no master but guardian in Philip's court. That made them guilty by existence, but he was not reckless. He was methodical, cold, and strategic. He began to whisper, to plant seeds in the minds of courtiers and clerics alike, that the Templars were heretics, idolaters, sorcerers who spat on the cross and kissed each other's backsides in midnight rituals, that they worshipped strange gods, hoarded secret texts, and schemed in silence behind their stone walls, absurd, laughable until it wasn't. In 1305, Philip maneuvered to place Clement V, a weak and pliable French pope, on the papal throne. a man whose spine had been softened by debt and fear. And from that moment, the gears began to turn. Letters were drafted, secret investigations begun, and Philip gathered a circle of lawyers, inquisitors, and torturers, not soldiers, for this would not be a war of swords, but of accusations sharpened like daggers, of confessions wrung from flesh, of spectacle dressed as justice. And then, the date was chosen, Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, a day now cursed in legend. But for the Templars, it was just dawn breaking like any other, until the knock at the gates came not from pilgrims or allies, but from royal guards, with sealed orders, iron chains, and grim silence across France. Hundreds of Templars were arrested in a single stroke, taken from their beds, their commanderies ransacked, their archives seized, their leaders dragged away as traitors before. Their guilt had even been uttered, and as the prisons filled and the church stood silent, Philip smiled not with joy, but with the cold satisfaction of a king who had just declared war on a memory, a myth, and a brotherhood whose only true crime was standing in the way of a throne that feared being questioned. That there are places where light never reaches, not because the sun forgets them, but because men forbid it, and it was in such places, behind thick stone walls soaked in mildew and rot, that the Knights Templar were unmade not by sword, but by silence, flame, and the machinery of fear disguised as justice. In the wake of their arrest, the order's leader Jacques de Molay, Geoffroy de Charny, and dozens of veteran commanders were shackled, starved, and stripped not just of rank, but of the dignity they had worn like armor for decades. The accusations were wild, contradictory, and obscene, denying Christ, spitting on the cross, kissing obscene parts of each other's bodies, worshipping a demonic idol called Baphomet, engaging in secret rites soaked in blasphemy and paganism. And yet the absurdity of the charges did not save them, because truth, in Philip's France, was no longer something discovered, it was something forced, twisted out of men on the rack until bones snapped, or submerged in water until lungs filled, or burned with irons until flesh peeled from the soul. The Inquisition, armed not with evidence but with intent, turned Templar confessions into ritual performances of pain, where guilt was not proven, but extracted like poison, whether it existed or not. Jacques de Molay, broken by weeks of agony, confessed yes. He said, "I denied Christ. I spit on the cross," and for a moment, Philip's narrative triumphed. Printed in papal edicts and shouted in cathedral squares, the Holy Order has fallen, not by betrayal, but by its own corruption. And yet, as days passed, something began to fracture. Templars recanted, even under threat of death, even in chains, even with the flames being prepared. They said their confessions were lies, but with agony, spoken to stop the pain, not because they were true. And in these recantations, a deeper truth emerged, not about idolatry, but about power. That the Templars were not destroyed because they were evil, but because they were inconvenient, to independent, to wealthy, to rooted in a past the new order of kings no longer wanted. Across Europe, monarchs hesitated. Some refused to arrest their local Templars, others quietly ignored the edicts, while a few even offered sanctuary. And though the Pope had been bent, the Church itself began to doubt. But still, in France, the trials continued, a slow theater of pain where justice was performed like a sacred lie. And Philip, hungry for finality, pushed ever harder, needing not just the confession of heresy, but the death of the legend, the utter erasure of an order that had once defied thrones by kneeling only to heaven. And as the years dragged on, the trial of the Templars ceased to be about guilt or innocence and became a monument to control, a symbol to every noble and bishop that even the holiest among them could be unmade, unpersoned, and undone not by truth, but by decree. Came not with thunder, nor with fanfare, but with ink cold, black, final. On March 22nd, 1312, Pope Clement V, pressed like parchment beneath the heel of Philip IV, issued the papal bull Vox in Excelso, formally dissolving the order of the Knights Templar, not by proof of guilt, but by the weight of scandal, fear, and the crushing machinery of monarchy masquerading as divine will. It was a coward's decree wrapped in sacred cloth, a document that acknowledged no heresy, no doctrine broken, and yet stripped the Templars of everything: their name, their lands, their privileges, their place in the great spiritual hierarchy they had once defended with blood and fire. The justification: scandal alone had corrupted the order beyond repair, a legal fiction, a politically convenient corpse to bury before the stench of injustice spread too far. And so, across Christendom, the red cross of the Templars vanished from castles, seals, banners, and documents, scrubbed like blasphemy from the record. But their possessions remained, vast and tantalizing: hundreds of commanderies, fortresses, estates, vineyards, treasuries, armories, and an international financial network that rivaled any king's, now leaderless, masterless, and up for grabs. Officially, these assets were to be transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, another crusading order still in good standing, but in practice, it was a feast of vultures. Monarchs seized what they could. Nobles laid claim to abandoned lands, and, in France, Philip's men looted with impunity, cloaking their theft in piety and legalism. And yet, the true mystery, the whispered fire that would fuel centuries of obsession, was what wasn't found. The central treasury, the rumored relics, the sacred texts, the gold said to be hidden beneath the Paris temple, the artifacts gathered, in the East gone, vanished into shadow, never documented, never recovered. And from this silence grew legend: the lost Templar treasure, the Holy Grail, Baphomet, the Ark, coded scrolls, the founding of secret societies, bloodlines of kings, a storm of myths born not from fact, but from the void that Philip's greed had created. A void history could not close. But while treasure hunters would chase ghosts, the truth was more tragic than golden. The Templars, for all their might and mystique, had become too large for the age that followed them. A relic of an era when war and holiness were one, when death was a gateway and the sword a form of prayer. The world had changed, faith had grown political. Kings had learned to use courts like weapons, and the church had learned that silence could serve power just as well as fire. And so the Templars were buried not beneath earth, but beneath narrative, shaped not by their own words, but by the ink of those who feared them, and in that burial they became not forgotten, but immortal, not erased, but unreachable. A brotherhood that had outlived itself by dying in fire rather than bowing to a crown had been many things: commander, diplomat, confessor, prisoner, but in the final breath of his life, Jacques de Molay became something more dangerous than all of them: a martyr who would not stay silent. By 1314, he had endured nearly 7 years of captivity, 7 years of humiliation, of rot-eaten dungeons and interrogations masked as mercy, 7 years of waiting while the world debated whether the order he led would be damned, forgotten, or simply folded into history like a shameful page no one dared reread. He had confessed under torture, as they all had, but unlike most, he recanted. Not in whispers, but in defiance, not in secret, but in the open square of Paris itself, where the stakes were real and the fire already smoldering beneath the woodpile. That would become his grave, summoned to publicly confirm his guilt. De Molay stood before the papal envoys and the king's agents and denied everything: no heresy, no idol worship, no blasphemy, no betrayal of Christ, only lies spoken through, shattered ribs, and the stink of blood, forced from him by men who served thrones, not God. And in that moment, the political theater cracked, for this was not a broken man begging for mercy, but a knight reclaiming his soul in front of the world. And Philip, watching from behind veils of velvet and steel, knew he could not allow it. The sentence was immediate, unceremonious, and final: death by fire. The punishment for relapsed heretic, the penalty reserved not for criminals, but for symbols too stubborn to die quietly. That evening, March 18, 1314, as the sun began to sink over the Seine. A pyre was built on a small island in the river the El de la Cite. In the shadow of Notre Dame, man Jacques de Molay was led there with Geoffroy de Charny, another senior Templar who had also recanted, both men bound not just in chains, but in a final brotherhood of flame. They were offered mercy if they would confess once more, and both refused. And then, as the flames began to rise, as smoke curled around the bones of Paris and the scent of burning flesh mingled with the prayers of the crowd, Jacques de Molay did what no one expected. He cursed. With his face lit by the fire that would consume him, he called upon God to judge his executioners, to summon Pope Clement and King Philip before the divine throne within a year, and let the heavens decide whose soul bore the greater stain. And then he died, not screaming, not pleading, but silent, staring into the horizon as if seeing beyond the pyre, beyond the crown, beyond the age itself. And the people, watching, did not cheer, they whispered, they trembled, because even those who hated the Templars felt something shift, like history itself had winced. And what followed would become legend. Pope Clement died 1 month later, choked by illness. Philip died the same year, struck down by a sudden stroke while hunting in the woods. Both men gone before the ashes of de Molay had even cooled down. So the final prophecy of the Templars was born in fire, not in revenge, but in witness. A warning etched into history's skin like a brand. You can destroy a man, but not the truth he dies for. Fire had gone out, but its light refused to die. In the months and years that followed the execution of Jacques de Molay, the streets of Europe did not forget. They whispered, and in those whispers, the ashes of the Templars became embers again. Kings who had once stayed silent now shifted, in their thrones with unease. Bishops murmured of curses behind cathedral walls, and peasants lit candles not for their lords, but for the memory of knights burned alive while keeping their silence. For something in the manner of their deaths rang truer than the lies that condemned them. Philip IV, who had thought himself the final word in the Templar story, was dead within months, and his sons, each in turn, would wear the crown like a noose. None would rule long. None would die peacefully. And the Capetian line, once the unshakable spine of France, would collapse within a single generation, as though history itself had turned against the bloodline that spilled the orders. The papacy, too, reeled from its complicity. Clement V's death brought no redemption, only silence. And the Church, ever eager to distance itself from scandal, locked the Templar archives, buried the bulls, and tried to pretend the trial had never happened, reducing the once holy warriors to footnotes and rumors. And yet, the world would not let them rest. In Spain and Portugal, where the Templars had not been persecuted with such venom, many were quietly absorbed into other orders. The Order of Christ, the Order of Montesa, new names for old vows. Cloaks with different symbols but the same fire beneath. In England, Scotland, and parts of Germany, many former Templars simply disappeared, slipping into monasteries, becoming local knights, or vanishing into the fog of legend, leaving behind stone ruins, lost codes, and grave markers etched with worn-down crosses no one could quite interpret. And so began the second life of the Templars, not in armies, but in myths, not in crusades, but in conspiracies. Their legacy no longer written by monks, but by dreamers, heretics, poets, and rebels. People began to speak of hidden treasures, buried scrolls, relics smuggled from Jerusalem, secrets passed through generations. And as the Renaissance dawned and the Enlightenment stirred, the idea of the Templars transformed from crusading knights to guardians of forbidden wisdom, from loyal servants of Rome to silent keepers of truth to dangerous for kings or popes. And though no document ever confirmed it, the whispers grew louder that the Templars had not died, only gone underground, waiting, watching, preserving what the Church had tried to burn. And so they became what no sword could kill, a symbol, and symbols, once born in blood. Do not die, they echo. It began as a whisper in the cellars of burned-out temples and crumbling fortresses. A question too dangerous for monks to answer aloud, but too irresistible for chroniclers to ignore. What did the Templars die protecting? Because if the order had truly been just a band of warrior monks, then why the urgency to erase them from the world? Why the suddenness of the arrests, the secrecy of the trials, the obsession with extracting not just confessions but locations? From the moment Philip's men stormed Templar strongholds across France, they weren't just looking for men, they were looking for something buried. Legends speak of vaults beneath Temple Mount, guarded since the First Crusade, where the Templars had supposedly discovered scrolls from Solomon's Temple, sacred texts, esoteric knowledge, or even the bones of saints, relics so spiritually radioactive they could undo both church and crown if misused. Others claimed the Templars had hidden away the Holy Grail, not a literal cup perhaps, but a symbol of divine power, something Rome had long buried to preserve its monopoly on salvation. Then there was the Ark of the Covenant, whispered to have been spirited out of Jerusalem under Templar escort, locked away in secret catacombs beneath Rosslyn Chapel, or buried under the ruined temples of Cyprus or Acre. And while most historians scoffed, kings kept digging, and popes kept searching, because the money was real, even if the relics were not. During their rise, the Templars had amassed not just swords and castles, but land deeds, shipping routes, gold reserves, and coded documents so dense that even modern economists marvel at their complexity. Entire garrisons vanished overnight after the arrests. Vaults were found empty. Ships docked one day and gone the next. What happened to the Templar fleet in La Rochelle? No one knows, but many believe it sailed into a storm not of nature, but of history, carrying with it the last secrets of the order. And it's here the truth blurs with myth. Some say those ships made landfall in Scotland, aligning with the rebels of Bannockburn and silent vengeance against the Pope. Others claim they went west, beyond the known world, centuries before Columbus, hiding their truths in new lands, planting symbols in stone, leaving behind trails of architecture and geometry that still make Masonic lodges shiver. But no document has ever confirmed it, and no vault has ever been opened. Still, the rumor lives, not because it is proven, but because it explains the ferocity of their destruction. Because men do not burn others alive for merely failing. They burn them to keep secrets buried, to silence those who knew too much. Long after their bodies had turned to ash and their swords rusted, beneath foreign soil, the Templars rose again, not in flesh, but as an idea too powerful to die. And that idea would become a thorn in the heel of empires. They became the first warriors of modern myth, part martyr, part rebel, part prophet, a brotherhood not of stone, but of secrecy. As the centuries turned and Europe staggered into the age of revolutions and reason, whispers of Templar survival took root in the minds of those who saw through the hypocrisy of kings and the hollow chants of the church, not because they believed in lost grails or buried treasure, but because the Templars represented something far more dangerous, a system outside the system, a loyalty that answered to no throne, no priest, no flag. From the ashes of that shattered brotherhood rose the seeds of what would become the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, and dozens of other shadowed movements, organizations not necessarily born from the Templars, but whose founders draped themselves in the myth of the fallen knights like a second skin, the compass and square, the keystone and the unfinished pyramid, all took on new meaning when placed beside the image of the Templar cross. It was rebellion in code, resistance in ritual, in France. During the Enlightenment, Templar symbols surfaced in salons and societies, in paintings and poems, whispered among scholars and dissidents who believed the church and monarchy were rotting from within. And when the fires of revolution finally roared to life in 1789, some claimed it was Jacques de Molay's curse that felled Louis XVI, guillotined like a lamb during Lent, the final echo of a king-killing brotherhood long thought buried in the Americas, the myth traveled further. Founding fathers, revolutionaries, architects of the New World all flirted with the romance of the Templar Code, a sacred order defying tyranny, bound by honor, betrayed by power. And with every passing decade, the line between fact and symbol blurred further. Novels were written, symbols carved into churches, strange rituals enacted under moonlight in forests and vaults. Historians tried to peel away the myth, but the public didn't want truth. They wanted fire. Because the Templars had become a cipher for every soul crushed by systems to corrupt, to challenge directly. And so, centuries after their fall, their ghosts walked beside every man who dared question a crown, burn a holy book, or challenge the weight of silence, a memory too dangerous to be forgotten. Beneath the cold vaults of medieval prisons, where no light dared linger and the scent of mold clung to stone like rot to a wound, the knights who once walked with kings were stripped naked of title, brotherhood, and even self, because the trials of the Templars were not trials at all, but a ritual humiliation, a breaking of the spirit orchestrated by men who wielded chains as rosaries and fear as gospel. The Inquisitors came cloaked not just in cloth, but in sanctioned cruelty, armed with papal bulls and the blessings of kings. And what followed was not justice, but performance, a spectacle of agony meant to manufacture guilt from silence. Jacques de Molay, the aging Grand Master, stood not alone, but beside his brothers, men who had fought in the Holy Land, who had held their friends as they died in the dust, who had prayed over the bones of saints, and now they were accused of heresy, idolatry, spitting on the cross, of kissing each other in secret places and worshipping severed heads that spoke in tongues. Absurd charges, yes, but absurdity is the language of tyrants. For no lie is too large when fear is its audience. The rack stretched limbs until joints burst. The strap-auto dislocated shoulders with a yank. Iron boots crushed toes into splinters. And hot coals singed flesh the names of Christ into the thighs of knights who once guarded the holiest places on earth. Some broke. Dozens confessed to things they never did, begging only to die faster, while others refused, enduring mutilation, with silence until their tongues could no longer shape the words of defense. Yet even among the tortured, the truth flickered like a dying candle. Many retracted their confessions the moment the torturer stepped away, only to be dragged back and broken again. Guilt was a cycle, repentance a weapon, and de Molay, proud and stubborn, endured it all. But he would not denounce the order, would not betray his brothers, would not hand over the myth Philip wanted so badly to control. And so the trials dragged on for years, with parchments filled with poison and courts stuffed with puppets. And through it all the church watched, uneasy, for while it had consented to the purging, it had not expected it to unravel so completely. Rome had wanted a pruning, Philip wanted a slaughter. And that is exactly what he made of it. The river ran dark that morning, heavy with the silence of a city that knew it was witnessing something, sacred and rotten all at once, the kind of silence that presses on the chest like a stone slab. It was March 18, 1314, when Jacques de Molay, last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was led through the streets of Paris not as a hero, not as a priest, not even as a criminal, but as a relic, the dying embers of an age the world no longer had use for. Beside him walked Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, another knight carved from the same iron faith. Both men bound not just by rope but by a shared refusal to kneel before lies. Their confessions had been made under torture, but when the moment came to repeat them publicly, to play the part of the guilty, they refused. "We are innocent," de Molay cried, "and we die unjustly." And with those words, King Philip's last hope of a clean execution turned to ash before the fire even touched skin. Number cleric was called, no sermon offered, no last rites granted, only flames, rising fast from the wood stacked on the El de la site like a pagan altar, licking the hems of their robes, climbing like serpents toward heaven as the two knights stood still, not screaming, not weeping, but locked in a final, impossible dignity. Eyewitnesses would later claim de Molay didn't burn like a man, but stood like a statue, his face carved in defiance until the fire finally took his eyes, and then came the words, not whispered, but shouted over the roar of fire, a curse, cast into history like a blade thrown from the grave. Pope Clement, King Philip, before this year is out, I summon you both to judgment and history. Like a bloodhound, followed the curse, for Clement died within a month, sickened and frantic, and Philip followed before the year's end, choking on his breath as if the smoke of de Molay's pyre had lodged in his lungs. Coincidence? Perhaps. But history is not built on coincidences. It's built on memory and fear, and stories too perfect to disbelieve. And so the Templar curse was born, whispered in taverns and palaces alike. A fire that burned long after the flames died, haunting not just those who lit the pyre, but every king who ever feared the cost of betrayal when the flames on the L. De la Site smoldered down to embers, and the ashes of Jacques de Molay mixed with the spring winds over the Seine. France thought it had buried the Templars once and for all, but kings often forget that an idea is harder to kill than a man, and a brotherhood forged in blood and bound by vows does not die in public. It vanishes in silence. Across Europe, survivors of the order slip beneath the surface like stones cast into deep water. Some shave their beards, shed their habits, and sought shelter in sympathetic monasteries or fled to lands beyond the reach of Rome's shadow. In Portugal, where King Denis refused to let loyalty be rebranded as heresy, many Templars were quietly absorbed into a new order, the Order of Christ, cloaked in new symbols, yet guided by old vows, keeping the fire alive under a different name. Others turned mercenary, fighting in obscure wars across the Balkans, Spain, or Anatolia. Their swords still sharp, but their banners hidden, ghost soldiers in a world that now called them traitors. But perhaps the most dangerous thing they left behind wasn't flesh. It was legend. Whispers of a vast treasure smuggled from Paris before the arrests, carts of gold and relics, sacred texts and secrets guarded by the elite, said to have vanished into the night, never found, never proven, yet always believed. Some said it was hidden in the Pyrenees, others claimed it reached Scotland aboard Templar ships, welcomed by sympathetic lords beyond the clutch of papal law. There were tales of underground vaults, encrypted maps, sealed chapels, and temples beneath cathedrals where the old rites were still practiced in the dead of night. And as these stories spread, the Templars became more than history. They became myth, transformed by time from warriors of Christ into keepers of forbidden knowledge, the sort of knowledge kings feared and heretics sought. Philip had tried to kill them with fire, but he had only made them immortal, not in flesh, but in symbol, a brotherhood betrayed but unbroken, echoing through Freemason rites, Crusader romanticism, and the fever dreams of every man who believed. That truth still slept beneath stone. The burning of the Templars was not just the end of an order, it was the beginning of an unraveling. A slow but violent shift in the tectonic plates of medieval power. For centuries, the church had stood like a mountain, unmoving, unchallenged, crowned by Rome and reinforced by 1,000 cathedrals whose spires scraped the heavens. But when Pope Clement V allowed the blood of the Templars to stain his robes, he signed away the church's moral monopoly, not with a sword, but with silence. The people saw it. Saw how the Pope had bent to the will of a king, how justice had been strangled by royal debt and papal cowardice, and in that moment, faith began to fracture, trust cracked like old marble, and the papacy, once the hammer of Christendom, now looked like a tool, wielded by secular hands, compromised and trembling. Within a generation, the Pope would no longer sit in Rome, but in Avignon, under the thumb of French kings, igniting what historians would call the Babylonian captivity of the Church, an era of shame and submission that hollowed out the Vatican's authority from within. And while the Church bled its spiritual power, The kings of Europe tightened their grip, especially Philip IV, who, emboldened by the destruction of the Templars, now moved to consolidate control over France's wealth, its clergy, and its courts. He levied taxes on the church, installed spies in monasteries, and pushed toward absolutism, setting the foundations for a future where kings would no longer beg for blessings, but command divine right by force. The old balance, that fragile truce between altar and throne, was shattered, replaced by a new world where money, not miracles, governed policy, and blood sealed bargains faster than prayers. The execution of the Templars was not a one-off act of cruelty. It was a rehearsal, a prototype for the age to come, where loyalty was transactional, power centralized, and faith became either a currency or a casualty. And beneath it all, the ghosts of the temple lingered, not as saints or martyrs, but as a warning carved in flame. When institutions turn on their own to feed kings, they destroy the very myths that held their world together. Across Europe, the pyres that consumed the Knights Templar cast a shadow longer than any cathedral, reaching into the hearts of monarchs, cardinals, and commoners alike, a darkness not of fire, but of fear. For if a king could burn God's warriors with the blessing of Rome, who then was safe? In England, Edward II, reluctant participant in Philip's purge, grew increasingly paranoid, issuing edicts, then retracting them, his court divided between loyalty and caution, unsure whether to emulate the French model or resist its cynicism. In the German principalities, whispers of Templar survivors turned into rumors of hidden militias, fueling unrest among nobles already bristling under the weight of fractured empires and papal taxes. In Italy, city-states eyed one another with suspicion, each fearing the other might secretly harbor the so-called Shadow Knights, men who had once commanded fleets, gold, and influence across 3 continents. And in Iberia, the Templars may have lost their name, but their power simply changed masks. Their fortresses renamed, their leaders reassigned, their wealth redirected under the silent protection of kings who preferred discretion to destruction. But it was not just politics that felt their absence, it was imagination. Across Europe, artists, mystics, and madmen began to weave the Templar fall into a tapestry of apocalyptic myth, the Avenging Order, punished for discovering secrets too sacred for kings, keepers of the Holy Grail, custodians of ancient relics, buried beneath Solomon's temple, betrayed not for their sins but for their silence. These stories spread like wildfire, morphing fact into legend, and by the dawn of the Renaissance, the Templars were no longer remembered as mere knights. They had become symbols of resistance, mystery, and forbidden knowledge. Secret societies claimed descent from them, from the Freemasons to the Rosicrucians, each invoking the Templar mythos as proof of their own ancient legitimacy. Even Protestant reformers, centuries later, would point to their execution as evidence of papal corruption and royal tyranny, a martyrdom that transcended time. And in this strange afterlife, the Templars won a victory more profound than any crusade. They endured not through survival, but through story. Their brotherhood resurrected again and again by those who sought to challenge authority, to cloak rebellion in sacred armor, and to remind the world that what is burned does not always die. Sometimes, it becomes legend. They were gone, vanished in fire and decree, but the world refused to let the Templars die. In the centuries that followed, their name was passed like a relic between rebels, mystics, and dreamers, each wrapping their cause in the tattered cloak of the temple and claiming inheritance to a legacy that no longer had a face. What began as whispers among peasants turned into sermons in shadowy chapels, where priests spoke not of Christ alone, but of a secret brotherhood, betrayed by Rome and kings, guardians of a truth too ancient and dangerous for the world to bear. Medieval poets and troubadours began to tell of a hidden order still alive, wandering the earth in silence, awaiting the day they would rise again and bring justice to the corrupt. An idea so intoxicating it seeped into every layer of European folklore. And then came the Grail, not as a cup, but as a symbol, an obsession. A myth forged in the fires of collective guilt. Templar survivors, it was said, had rescued the Grail from Jerusalem and hidden it far from greedy hands in mountains, cloaked in fog or beneath cathedrals carved in secret code. From the Pyrenees to Scotland, maps and manuscripts began to suggest that the Holy Grail, the bloodline of Christ, or some lost wisdom from Solomon's temple, had passed into Templar hands, and that their execution had been the silencing of, not a corrupt order, but of a divine truth. The occultists took the tale further. Rosicrucians spoke of Templar rituals older than Christianity. Freemasons encoded symbols in architecture claiming descent from Templar builders, and alchemists claimed the fire that burned the knights had not destroyed them, but transfigured them into vessels of eternal knowledge. Even in the Enlightenment, that so-called age of reason, men like Voltaire and Goethe invoked the Templars as martyrs of tyranny, burned by superstition and royal greed. And by the time the 19th and 20th centuries arrived, the myth had mutated again. Now the Templars were secret kings, puppet masters, keepers of lost civilizations, buried under the sands of Egypt or encoded into the stars. Conspiracy theories flourished, from the Templars founding America to their role in the French Revolution, to surviving bloodlines woven into royal houses. And yet, for all the wildness of these tales, they stem from a single, brutal truth, that those who wielded ultimate power had feared the Templars enough to destroy them utterly. And so, whether history remembers them as saints, sinners, or symbols, one thing remains clear. Legends are born not from perfection, but from fire, and the world still feels the heat of the pyres. Lit the day in Paris. The wind howled across, the same like a funeral hymn as the executioners fastened chains around the last Grand Master's arms. Jacques de Molay stood not as a broken man, but as a defiant relic of an age now buried in papal decrees and royal cowardice. Behind him, the flames licked at the timbers, eager to consume flesh as they had consumed parchment, silence as they had devoured memory. But before the torch was lit, de Molay raised his voice, not in plea, not in prayer, but in judgment. Pope Clement, he shouted, King Philip, I summon you both before the tribunal of God within the year. And the crowd, packed along the banks and bridges of Paris, gasped as if heaven itself had cracked open, for in that moment, the man they had chained became something else, a prophet, a martyr, an accuser speaking not just to thrones, but to time itself. Within weeks, smoke still hanging over the city, Pope Clement V was dead, sickened. Some said, by guilt, others by divine wrath. And before a year had passed, King Philip IV, the Iron King, the architect of the purge, the monarch who had stared down popes and defied crusaders, fell dead from a stroke while hunting. His body dropped like an omen upon the forest he had once ruled, and so the myth was born, seated not by scribes but by silence. Because what kind of curse kills kings? What force? What judgment? What cosmic retribution could echo from a burning man and shake the crowned heads of Europe? In the years that followed, Philip's line, the Capetians, would unravel. With stunning speed, one son after another dead, dethroned, or dishonored, culminating in the 100 Years' War, a century of blood that tore France apart like a garment cursed from within. For believers, the line from Molay's death to the downfall of France's royal house was not coincidence. It was divine reckoning, the unholy price of betraying God's warriors and spilling their blood not on battlefield, but on scaffold. And even centuries later, revolutionaries in 1789 would remember the curse, tearing down the monarchy with cries of justice that echoed eerily. Those of de Molay, the Templar fire, it seemed, had never truly gone out. It had simply moved, underground, smoldering in myth and prophecy, in the memory of men who understood that some deaths don't end a life, they begin a legend. And if Molay's final breath carried a curse, then it was not just for kings and popes. It was a warning to power itself that truth may bend, but it does not break, and when it burns, it leaves scars on history's very soul. Centuries had passed, empires risen and crumbled, popes crowned and buried. Yet the cross-patty of the Templars still lingered like smoke after fire, not as a military force or papal order, but as a mythic echo that refused to die. In dusty cathedrals and ruined strongholds, from Portugal to Poland, whispers endured that some knights had escaped the purge, that hidden chapters of the order had gone underground, masked in silence, cloaked in secrecy, not for revenge, but for preservation. Portugal's King Dinis had refused to persecute the Templars, instead simply renaming them the Order of Christ, allowing many to live and serve anew under a different banner, same blood, different name, and in Scotland, legend clung to the Battle of Bannockburn like due to a sword, claiming the Templar horsemen emerged from the mist, turned the tide for Robert the Bruce, and vanished once again. But as Europe changed, as reason replaced religion, and revolution replaced royalty, the Templar myth did not fade. It adapted, evolving from medieval brotherhood into symbolic resistance. Freemasons invoked their name and rituals, Rosicrucians claimed their alchemical wisdom, and in time, the Templars were recast not merely as warriors of the cross, but as guardians of hidden truth, keepers of sacred geometry, forbidden relics, even ancient alien knowledge in the minds of the fringe. By the 20th century, their image had exploded in the full-blown cultural resurrection, from Nazi occultists scouring castles for the Holy Grail to Dan Brown's fictional conspiracies, video games, novels, and documentaries, all twisting threads from the same flaming cord. The irony was brutal. An order once purged for wealth and secrecy now lived on in the very myths of power and mystery that had damned them. And yet, beneath the noise, one quiet truth endures. The Templars, real men, born of faith, raised in war, consumed by politics, left behind not treasure, but questions. Who truly betrayed them? And why did they ever wield the power the myths claim? Or is it that the world, robbed of its heroes and weary of its kings, has simply needed the Templars, needed them as a mirror, a metaphor, a myth that reminds us how easily idealism is sacrificed on the altar of power? And so today, their Red Cross endures in books, flags, tattoos, and dreams, not because they survived, but because their story speaks to something older than gold, older than Rome, the longing for purity in a corrupt world, the dream that somewhere a brotherhood still walks unseen, guarding truths too dangerous for kings. They died screaming, praying, cursing, and confessing, some innocent, some guilty, all betrayed. But the tragedy of the Knights Templar was never just their burning. It was the way their fire lit a path into the darker corridors of power, showing how righteousness becomes dangerous when it threatens the corrupt. They had begun as poor warrior monks, sworn to humility and the sword, and ended as symbols, feared by kings, envied by bishops, erased by decree. Yet for all the flames that consumed them, their essence remained uncorrupted, because what they stood for could not be drowned in royal greed or papal silence. Courage, loyalty, discipline, and a belief, flawed, but fierce, that a man could be both soldier and saint. And so history did not bury the Templars. It transformed them from mere knights into martyrs of ambition's cruelty, into avatars of a timeless struggle between faith and fanaticism, loyalty and politics, truth and the machinery of empires. Theirs is not the story of failure, but of sacrifice, a cautionary epic that warns what happens when ideals become inconvenient, when unity becomes a threat to tyrants, when silence is enforced by the sword. Centuries later, we still whisper their name not because of relics or conspiracies, but because we recognize something familiar in their fall. The quiet dread that justice is not always victorious, and that power devours its own saints when they grow too strong. And maybe that's why the Templar cross still burns in the modern mind. Because it stands for the warrior who held the line when kingdoms trembled, who perished not in battle, but in betrayal, and who, in death, exposed a truth no crown could bury. That faith without justice is hollow, and power without virtue is doomed to rot from within. Their order is gone, but their warning remains, etched in fire across the ages. Beware the king who kneels at the altar only to seize its gold, and beware the world that allows truth to burn while lies wear the crown. This has been Candle and Coffin. Let this story linger like smoke in your lungs. If it moved you, subscribe for more untold histories that shaped our world. And before you go, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? I love seeing how far this story travels, across oceans, borders, and centuries, because history, like a buried sword, always finds its way back to the surface.